welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our memory demo, which is part of our fundamentals demo. Memory demo focuses on some of the nuances in the Java programming language, and particularly in this video, we're going to take a look at how we can pass an array of integers to a function and actually make some changes to the array inside the function. Now, this video assumes that you've been following along a little bit already with our memory demo and looked at how individual integers and strings are handled. And in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to update an integer array inside of a function that does, in fact, have no return value. Now, I'll leave this function signature in the comments section, or you can just take a second to pause the video and to go ahead and copy this signature. But you'll notice here that I'm passing an array of integers that I call inputs, and the function has no return value. So in other words, basically, if you've been following along in the earlier videos, you would expect that there isn't going to be a lot we can do in this particular example. Let's see if we are in fact correct. Now, you'll note that this is an array of integers, which means that I'm going to need to do an operation on multiple values. I should be doing some checks to make sure, for instance, that this is not a null value or a null variable that's being passed, etc. I'm going to be basically very flippant about some of this. I'm just going to jump straight into this. And so the idea here is that I want to go ahead and create then a local variable that I'm going to call index. And I'm going to use that to simply loop through each of the elements in our inputs array. And I'm going to do some sort of trivial operation to them. In other words, I'm basically going to just simply add a value to it, or what I can do in a later example is reverse the order of my integer array. But again, what we're going to do is we're going to keep this one fairly simple. And the idea here is I want to have a for loop. I'm going to use my index equal to 0, index then less than our inputs dot length, and then our index plus plus. And then what I want to do is I'm going to take whatever the value is for the inputs at that given index location, and I'm simply going to add 1 to it. Now, again, I'm going to use the longhand notation here. Whatever operation you do doesn't really matter, but the idea here is I want to demonstrate some sort of change here. In this case, I'm going to just add 1 to it. And then more importantly, you'll notice here that I'm in fact not returning anything because, again, I have a void in my function signature. I'm not going to be able to return a value or an array. So let's go ahead and call this particular example by going up to our main. We can go ahead and copy the template that we had created for our demo here and simply make some changes. And we could set up a variable that can be then passed to our little helper function here. We'll go ahead and change our switch from demo then to update int array. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and declare a variable. I'm going to go ahead and specify that it is of type integer, and it's going to be an array. And how about if we call this one a values? And I'm going to go ahead and initialize it. There's a couple of ways that we can go about doing this. I'm going to keep this one relatively short. So in other words, this is going to have 5 values in it. And then the idea here is I want to be able to loop through those values. So what I'm going to do is beforehand, outside of the for loop, outside of my function, I'm going to go ahead and again, I'm going to use my index variable. I'm going to loop through my values up to length, incrementing my index, and I'm going to have a system.out.println, and I'm going to use whatever the value is at that particular index. And again, I probably want to make this a little bit easier to read, so I'm going to call this outside. And we have our matching parentheses here, and then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this once before my function call, and then once after my function call. So we want to call our UpdateIntArray, and we want to pass it the values. And again, simply clean up our code a little bit here so we've got some nice looking code. What you can see here, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through the array twice, once before calling the function and then once after calling the function. And then probably also want to take just a second to go ahead and display some sort of noise inside of our function as well. And so again, I'm going to just simply reproduce this by doing a system.out.println. And what we can do is we can simply access our inputs, square brackets index. And again, probably not the worst thing in the world to simply go ahead and specify where we are in the code here. So this is going to be inside of our function. And again, this is going to be before and after. So we're going to go ahead and specify this. So this is before our operation and then after our operation. So hopefully you get the gist of what we're doing here. We're basically just trying to create a useful amount of noise on the command line. And at this point, then let's go ahead and give it a shot. And then we're going to go ahead and call our UpdateIntArray switch. So I'll go ahead and clear my command window. And our UpdateIntArray. And you can see here that outside, well, I probably didn't make that noise quite as nice as I should have. Let's take just a second to clean this up. If you were following along in this, you probably saw this and probably recognize that I missed my space there. Let's see if we've got any more that we need to clean up. Nope, the rest of them look pretty good. Let's go ahead and build it again. And there we go. That looks a little nicer. So basically what happens is outside when I loop through it the first time, well, as expected, I get my 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, just like I had assigned the values in the array. And then inside, basically 0 becomes 1, 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, 3 becomes 4, and 4 becomes 5. And then it gets interesting because when we return the control of the code back to our main, well, my array is already updated. However, I did not have a return value for my UpdateIntArray function. And so that should probably bother you a little bit because in the earlier videos, we saw that our variables were essentially by value. In other words, an entire copy of the variable was made to the function. In other words, inside, for instance, of our UpdateInt function, there was a copy of our input variable, and then any changes we made inside of our UpdateInt function remained inside of our UpdateInt, and the input variable that was in our main never got changed. Well, that's sort of what happens here, but it's not quite the same. And to understand a little bit about what is going on, I'm going to do something very strange. In other words, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here, I'm going to modify my UpdateIntArray, and I'm simply going to start off by saying inputs is equal to, and then I'm going to specify that I want a new integer array, and I'm going to go ahead and specify the values here of 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and I'm going to go ahead and give the usual number of values here, 3, 2, 1, and then 0. And before we go any further, then what I want to do is I want to actually go ahead and break this down. I'm going to repeat my for loop before I make this change. And I want to simply break out this first system.out.println. And in other words, I'm going to loop through all of the elements in the array, in my integer array, before I make any changes, before I reassign the values. And so if I build this, and I come back here to my command prompt one more time, nothing has changed in our main, but you'll see that now I have a very, very different output. And specifically, you'll notice here that I start off with a 5-element array going from 0 to 4, much like what we saw earlier in the video. And then it gets passed to our function here. So there's our 0, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. As a matter of fact, why don't I take just a second here to go ahead and put a little extra noise in here. I'm going to throw in one more system.error, or rather a system.out print line. And what we want to do here is we'll see that effectively what's happening is I am working with the same variable, however, a different set of values inside of the function. I'm going to take this time to do one more additional system.out.println all the way down here at the end. Again, this is just to make this a little easier for us to read. One more time here. And you can see that beforehand, outside 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 inside the function. And then there's our print line that provides our gap here. But then I have reassigned to our inputs variable a whole new array of integers. And so there's our 10, 9, and so on, all the way down to 1. And well, why does it start off at 10? Well, we could see here that I've simply added the 1 to it, to my initial values. But more importantly, this array is then inside the function, but then when control is returned back to our main, well, we're back to our 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, what this tells us is that the array itself is copied to the function, the address essentially in memory of the array. But when we called our constructor here for the new integer array, well, the inputs then variable then pointed to a new array. And so essentially what this did is this disconnected us from the original array. In other words, basically, we could no longer access that individual array or those elements inside the array. And more importantly, then, if you think about it, the inputs variable itself, because it was a copy, the array itself was a copy, well, we essentially lost access to the elements in the initial array. So this new constructor, for all intents and purposes, destroyed our ability to access the original array. So then any changes that we made to the elements in the array moving forward were not reflected in the original array. So again, what I encourage you to do is play around with this a little bit. You can simply reproduce this effect by commenting out this particular line, in other words, our line 126, build it, and sure enough, if you go back to the command line and rerun this, well, we do in fact see the change. So in other words, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 inside the function before we do the addition, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 after we do the addition, but the addition to the individual elements does stick outside the array. And again, because we did not overwrite the array itself by calling the new constructor. Well, you probably want to go back and take a look at this, play around with this until you're comfortable with it. But basically, when you pass an array to a function, you can't change the array itself. You can, however, change the individual elements in the array. Now we're going to see all sorts of examples of this. We're actually going to leverage this in later examples with objects as well. So you can see there are some ways, in fact, to pass essentially a variable by reference. But again, it depends on what type of variable. In this case, we can actually make changes to the individual elements in the array. We can, however, not make a wholesale change to the array. Now, before we leave this particular topic, I want to point out that this also applies to resizing the array. We could go through and we could update this integer array by trying to add an element or even subtracting an element from the array, essentially resizing the array using one of the helper functions inside of Java, inside the Java framework. And again, that would not, in fact, work because it would cause you to have then an entire new array. And it would not simply just be a matter of changing the elements inside the array. So as long as you don't have to resize the array or overwrite the array in its entirety, by calling the new constructor, you can, in fact, edit the individual elements in the array. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.